I have the opportunity today to talk about First Nations people in British Columbia from a very personal perspective, because I really believe very much in the power of story. And even though I work in a very reductionist field of public health, where I very often report on the health of the people, I do like to talk. From a much more dramatic platform than an epi perspective. So today, I want to talk to you about Indigenous education. Even though I work as a chief medical officer, I work in health, I was asked to touch upon education from an Indigenous perspective. We're in Indigenous territories. From an Indigenous perspective, I hear very often from healthcare workers that there are First Nations people in their catchment areas, but from our point of view, there are healthcare workers in our territories. We're in ICHPUC territory, or Okanagan territory, and I come here very often. My sons live up here in the Vernon area, so I'm always pleased to come here. It's an incredibly beautiful place. And I mentioned Hawaii. I have some Hawaiian blood, but when I think of Hawaii and paradise, I learned from being in the tropics that we also live in an incredible paradise that very many people would love to live in. And in fact, many of you do, in fact, live here. These two masks are, one resides at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, the other is at the Louvre in Paris. They were collected in Metlakatla, and they were recently reunited, in 1875, though they were collected in the late 1800s. And they fit together, and no one knew in the present day that they fit one inside the other. And they just remind me that some things that sensibly go together, we have rendered apart. And when you put them together, it makes so much sense. This is an island in my territory called ICHPUC, and it's an island called Savory Island in English. If you cut it along the spine, one half belongs in private ownership or belongs to about 3,000 landowners, little tiny postage-sized stamps, pieces of real estate that are phenomenally expensive. The other side is in First Nations hands. It's completely undeveloped. You won't find a water system, you won't find a drain or a toilet, you won't even find a clearing to pitch your tent. And to me, it's a perfect example of the two solitudes that can exist in British Columbia and Canada, where Indigenous or original peoples exist alongside, but maybe not necessarily in neighborly relationships with immigrants to our territories. And immigration is not a bad word. Immigration exists in every country in the world. Immigration exists because we have two legs. We can move around. We're not trees. We don't have to stay where we took root or where we grew. And the story of immigration and the story of migration is an international viewpoint. And so the World Health Organization recognizes many dozens of countries that have Indigenous or original peoples that have been affected by waves of migration, and these countries exist on every continent, including here. And when I look at this picture, I often ask myself, where is the respect and the honor between the two sides of this island, between the two halves of this arranged marriage? And is there respect and honor between them? Or is there contempt? Or is there neglect? Or is there friendship? Is there neighborliness? This island has a very low water table. The people there need to share the resources that exist on the island, or they could fight, but I wonder how far that will get them. This is one of my elders from my home. She didn't go to residential school. Residential school, to me, typifies the lack of dominance that exists for many of us. We have many factors that press upon our lives, that change the course of the direction of our lives. And of course, if we were truly self-determining, we wouldn't have individuals or nations affecting the course of our lives. This particular woman was saying to me that her mother kept her home. In Canada, the old policy for Indigenous peoples was that children were removed when they became of school age around 5 or 6 years old, and they were institutionalized usually in institutions far from their home. Often there would be institutions close to their home, but they would be sent further afield so that the influence from their families would be lessened. Her family went on the run. She lived in the bush. If you lived on a reserve, your children were taken. And her mother believed, the Creator gave me children to raise. I didn't like the idea of others doing it for me. So I asked her, what did you do if you weren't in the school system? And she said, verbatim, we had nothing to do but help the people. This is my family. My parents met in residential school. And they actually, they met, I think, because they stayed together because they needed each other. My mother could read and write. She left home when she was 3. She stayed in residential school until she was 18, and she graduated from grade 12, which was very unusual for an Aboriginal woman in the 1950s. My father grew up on the run. He didn't learn English until he was a teenager. He grew up on the land. He can barely read and write. He learned to read and write as an adult worker in his 30s. But when they married, my mother went to live in my father's grandmother's house, and my father's grandmother didn't speak English, and he asked my mother to cook him fish head soup, which is really boiling a fish head in water. But my mother didn't know you were to take the gills out. And so my father's grandmother said, where did you find this woman? She doesn't even have the knowledge of a small child. But she had gone to residential school, and she hadn't learned our ways, even the simplest things. And so when we were growing up, my father said, the last thing this community needs is another useless person, and so you must learn our ways. Like, our ways are how to live right here in this territory and eat these fish and grow these plants and harvest these things and to live with your cousins in this place. Oh, sorry, I want to go back just because I forgot to tell you about, oh my gosh, I'm just going forward. Try this again. My elder was telling me about, or I was telling my elder about becoming a doctor. I was telling her about one day in Emerge, I had all of these very difficult patients. We had a car accident come in. There were 3 people in collars who needed to be cleared. We had not just one chest pain, but 2 chest pains. We had someone with a stroke. And wouldn't you know, some old lady asked me to go and get her a glass of water when I was so busy and important. And she said, oh, maybe she thought you were there to help. And that idea of service, I think, is one that is quite universal in our families, but it sometimes gets lost in the pursuit of our higher learning. As we learn a professional posture, we forget that getting water or baking bread for the community can make you a much loved and important person, not just the letters behind your name. So I left this very beautiful place where I was rich. I didn't know it. I thought we were poor because we couldn't buy things from the store in the same way that others could. But I had a father who knew his territory extremely well. And we would get up early, we would fish, and we would hunt. I would very regularly be pulled out of school. My father knew very well that I could read a book and remember, and that it was a talent like being short. It just was. And that my sisters, who were all wonderful, kind, decent, athletic, loyal people, were undervalued compared to my being overvalued, like a dog who could sing Chopin. But I would go fishing all the time with him, and he would say, everyone wants to sleep in with their loved ones in the morning, but we have work to do. And so from when I was very young, I would just get up and work, and I thought that made us poor. But I realized that the poor children who had nothing to do but to sleep in and wander about and watch television were the ones who were poor. And so this beautiful territory that I grew up in had many different aspects, just like this beautiful territory that you live in. It has wondrous sacred places. It's unique. It has some remote areas, And of course, it has real estate, it has resources to be extracted, it has water, it has material wealth, it has trees, fish and plant and animal life. But can you thrive here? Can you grow here? Can you learn here? And of course, you can. And I'm reminded when I see this slide, and this is of a very sacred place in a First Nation. The word in our language for tree is jeja, meaning cousin. It also means cousin, but it also means tree. And so when we say jeja, when we're in the forest, it feels like family, like a warm and beautiful place. And I laugh because my son's moms live up here, and they are very frightened of us going into the territories. They're always worried that our sons will come to no good, that they'll fall in a ravine, or a tree will fall on them, or weather will get them. And so we're constantly pulling and pushing, like how do we get in the territory without fear? How do we be in our territory in our way, which is a friendly way? I went away to school. I went to St. Michael's University School. I went to a boarding school, if you can imagine. My mother said, it's like I'm losing you to residential school. And my father said, no, this is different. You have a choice, and he's trying to better himself. And it's not a prison for children. And at St. Michael's, there was a really strong emphasis on having a very strong general education. And I insist, actually, in the doctors that I now employ, that they be very good generalists, not just specialists, and that they do what's sensible. I also went to an international school, and that was really very formative for me. Lester B. Pearson College of the Pacific was important to me because of the many different countries that attended, including Filipinos and many of the Europeans. Being a red Indian was really interesting, not mildly embarrassing, and they wanted to hear exactly how I grew up and how I lived and what it was like to be an Indigenous person in Canada. And when I had gone away to this school, my father kept saying to me, I didn't send you away to be schooled so you could disappear into the white man's army. You must come home and you must work. He didn't want me to become a general laborer. The point of my training was to come home and work with my cousins and the families that were at my home. But that was a lot of pressure. I call it the Great Red Hope Syndrome. Any Aboriginal person with a bit of talent and a bit of training is told you have to get a degree and help the people. And it's a very heavy burden. So I did what I thought was the silliest occupation I could find. I became an actor. This is a still from a movie that I did when I was 18 called Toby McTeague. I was walking down the street. I was a student at McGill in biochemistry. And a woman came up to me on the street and she said, "Are you an actor?" And I just lied, and I don't know why. I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, you come and audition for me tomorrow." And so I did, and I got what I call the first of my Tonto roles. I played the second lead, the best friend of the lead, Toby McTeague, the title character. And I went from being an undergraduate student to making $5,000 a week on a movie set. I'm saying silly lines like, "Toby, we're going to get in trouble." And I was 18, pretending I was, or feeling like I was 21. Acting like a 15-year-old on film, and film is pitched between a grade 3 to a grade 8 level, usually to a grade 3 level, and I thought, I can do this. I want to be an actor. So I worked as an actor for a long time, and I kept though on the film set, like bumping into things. I didn't know how to use my instrument. I would like bump into the camera when I was like walking and talking. I just had absolutely no skill whatsoever. And I saw the other young actors on set with me, and they all wanted to be stars. None of them wanted to train. None of them wanted to go to school to learn how to actually act. And I thought, if I want to be a real actor, I want to train to be a proper actor. And I went to theater school. And in theater school, in a university setting just like this, your classroom looks exactly like that. It's just a bare space with a bit of light so people can see you, because acting in the dark is a little bit pointless. In theater school, you fill an empty space with your humanity, with your stories, with who you are, and try and inform others, particularly an audience, about an experience that maybe they've never had. I remember once playing a boy who was sexually abused 8 times a week, 6 nights a week. 2 matinees. That was my job, was to portray sexual abuse of a child. And it's very painful to portray, but you do it with all your heart, hoping that people will learn something about it. This empty space, and it's literally called The Empty Space with a capital T, a capital E, and a capital S for us in the theater, this empty space is where I learned. And it reminds me that for many of us, where we learn and where we work and where we grow can be a sacred space. Or, what I learned in medical school, it can be a hellhole. So what are we creating in our universities and colleges? I did this movie called Smoke Signals. It came out just as I was entering medical school. In fact, in Calgary, I started medical school, and this movie opened on exactly the same week. And if you ever get a chance to be in an indie movie that wins lots of awards, I totally suggest you do it. It's really fun. How many of you have seen Smoke Signals? It's kind of old now, but good. Some of you have seen this American film from the 90s. In this film, I am portraying the most beautiful Aboriginal or Indigenous woman, elder, that you've ever met. And I would pray every day to try and capture the spirit of people who I thought were disappearing. That the glorious old women that I knew as a boy were disappearing, and that my nieces and nephews and my own children were growing up without knowledge of that old and beautiful way. I had no idea that anyone would see this movie until once I was helping to deliver a baby of an Aboriginal woman. I got paged, I rushed in. This woman was mid-push. The husband was losing it, like they always do. And he said, the baby's coming, can you help us? And I just stood to catch the baby, even though I was there actually as the pediatrician to help if the baby was in respiratory distress. I stood there to try and catch the baby if the baby came. And she came up to me many months later and said, do you remember me? Do you remember that day when you helped deliver my baby? And I said, no. Because a woman in the middle of labor looks extremely different than she does 6 months postpartum. Extremely different. They're just not recognizable. And she said, don't you remember I was pushing and I was so scared and I was swearing and it hurt so much? And then I opened my eyes and there was Evan Adams standing between my legs. Which to her was, quite exciting because she knew me as an actor and not as a doctor. So I spent 12 years in school. Some of it was amazing, some of it was transformative. Sometimes I wanted to quit, and I think that's actually quite normal, that you get pushed to the point where you say, I can't take it anymore. You exceed and go beyond your own expectations. You have people who believe in you, you have people who push you, and you have people who hinder you, and people who make it extremely difficult and painful for you. And sometimes I swear in medical school, during my surgery exam, I would much rather have gone through surgery than write the surgery exam. Like literally, just cut my head open, I'd rather do that, give me an A, than have to write this exam. But I kept moving. And it reminded me for many of us that the search for knowledge is like knowledge is a sacred cow. And my problem will be, can we milk her while keeping clear of her horns? Can I aspire to academia without being gutted by academia? So what's your space like? Are you regularly giving sacred knowledge and sacred milk to your students, or are you gutting them with your horns? It's also very funny. I really, as an actor turned medical student, I was really a bimbo actor. We learned how to do a breast exam with a model. I was given this fake breast. I gave it a little voice. I turned into a hand puppet. while I was in class. Medical students at the beginning have the knowledge of lay people. There's nothing differentiated about us at all. And then I remember the surgeon came in, this oncologic surgeon came in, and she said, yeah, laugh all you want, but if you miss a lump and your patient dies, you have to sleep at night. And it was a transformative moment where you realize, my gosh, I'm in charge of cancer, when 5 minutes ago I was an idiot actor who worried about his hair. How did this happen? And I think about it all the time because I feel constantly like that. And just because we're dealing with serious things doesn't mean that we can't laugh. And just because we're in charge of really important things doesn't mean that we don't feel inadequate sometimes. That, yeah, we are in charge of cities, we're in charge of young minds, we're in charge of lots of things that are really quite frightening to us. And so as a doctor, I learned something that I kind of knew. Aboriginal people in Canada are at the bottom of almost every available index of socioeconomic well-being. We come in last. We used to own everything and now own next to nothing. And that is partly our inheritance. And we must do something about this because race-based inequity is immoral. I remember being at Johns Hopkins, and if any of you have been to Baltimore, Baltimore is an 80% African-American city. And in the middle of it is this world-class university. And literally, in my Master's of Public Health class was not one single African-American student. Not one single African-American student in my Master's of Public Health class. We had a white professor saying, African-American babies die at twice the rate of white American babies. Why is that? There were some thoughts, some ideas. And the teacher said, maybe they're just designed like that. And I almost started screaming and swearing in my seat. And I said, this is public health. We spent 3 minutes talking about how to improve African-American babies' lives. And that was it. And that's all they got. And we just said, oh, they just die. Oh, well. And I thought, my gosh, I hope that my colleagues, when I get back to Canada, will do better than that discussion. And I went to speak to the professor about, what she said. And she said that I completely had misunderstood her point. And maybe I did. But that was a very, and maybe she was being intentionally provocative, but that moment stays with me, it stays with me, and if we're accepting people's deaths as being completely normal, rational, they just do that to themselves, they're just built that way, they just do that, they don't know any better, their mama didn't teach them, we are profoundly wrong, and we need to do better. So when we look at inequities and we say that our charges have poorer health than us, and isn't it terrible, we err. We can, as older learners, I know for younger learners it's easier to be a reductionist, but when we're older we can say, I can hold the humanity of my charges, their complexity, their sophistication, their happiness, their beauty, their right to equality, in my mind and in my heart. I can hold that space and I can say, let's do better for all of us. No one left behind, because I'm that kind of worker. In British Columbia, we've agreed that Indigenous health belongs to all of us. We have many, many agreements that tell us that Indigenous people's health is important to all British Columbians, and certainly especially British Columbia's 100,000 healthcare workers. We are trying to bridge inequity. So the challenge, the difference in health outcomes between First Nations and other British Columbians is unacceptable, and it's unsustainable. So what do? We have many formal agreements to work. And very often I would hear from workers things like, oh, we have to look after Aboriginal people, aren't they looked after by the federal government? Oh, we don't go to reserves because are we allowed to go there? We don't think Aboriginal people have the capacity to look after themselves, so why should we work with them? That's a lot of effort. That's just down the toilet. So I would remind them, well, actually we have formal agreement to address these complicated issues. So we actually have to work together. The First Nations themselves have ideas about their own health and wellness, and this is a very holistic approach. Really, it's very simply put, a mind, body, spirit approach. That if we're just looking after our bodies, we fail to address maybe some of the core causes of poor health, and that looking after one's mental health surely is as important as looking after one's physical health, and that someone in psychic pain certainly perhaps subjectively feels or has the same kind of suffering or comparable suffering as someone in physical pain. And certainly we must do what's moral. I always remember one of the great gods of public health, I can't remember his name, it just flew out of my head, say that actually smokers cost less than non-smokers to look after because they die so soon. But we don't promote smoking because we're in public health, because we're moral. We want everyone to do well. And so what makes us well? What makes us well? I thought doctors and healthcare workers were at the heart of health. But if you ask people what makes them well, and if you ask Indigenous people what makes them well, they will say things like beauty or love or opportunity, fairness, family, art, safety. And I know that we all hear in the news, we look south to our neighbors and we say, are those streets even safe? To us, from what the reporting shows us, it looks quite scary, the inequities that one can experience there. The pursuit of knowledge, recreation, certainty, and I'm sure that for each of you, you would add some really great words to this list of what makes you well. At the First Nations Health Authority, we ask a lot about governance. Who's in charge of what? In some cases, it's very clear the province is the lead. Like in cancer, we have the BC Cancer Agency, a world-class health institution that looks after British Columbians during their cancer journeys. And so we don't want a First Nations Cancer Agency. The BC Cancer Agency is the lead, and we follow. But when it comes to issues like our babies, we want to have say. We were meeting once with the chief coroner about the return of infant babies after their deaths. And the chief coroner said, actually by law, by provincial law, by the BC Coroners Act, I'm allowed to keep an infant baby's body for up to 2 months in order to determine a cause of death, and I can keep parts of that baby's body in our storage vaults for however long seems reasonable to me. And the chief said, yes, we know you think you're in charge, but we think these are our babies. We think those are our families. And it was such an important moment of our many hundreds of meetings around negotiation that you would see the client's voice, the patient's voice, their ownership of their own families and bodies and minds, where you say, I am just a stakeholder. I am not. Maybe I have authorities, maybe I have importance, maybe I can give life or death, but they certainly have some say, our clients, over their own health and well-being. And some of you must know A Gardener's Tale, Dr. Kamara Jones, Undoing Racism. The gardener notices that the red flowers flourish while the pink flowers languish, but she's forgotten her original decision that one is grown in rich soil and one is grown in poor soil. And she proclaims, I was right to prefer red over pink because the red are taller. So, let me be clear. You are the gardener, and how are your flowers? All your flowers, all your charges. And we must make things right, set things right in the garden. And I want to finish by saying, once I was looking after an elder whom I love very, very much. She had a very rapid, irregular heartbeat that very quickly could have degenerated into a fatal rhythm. I was just going off duty. I was leaving town. And she was having very strong symptoms, chest pain, a sense of impending doom. The doctor who was coming on said, I need to send you down south to Vancouver to an ICU or a CCU. We don't even have a monitor here to watch over your heartbeat. And she said, no, I'm from here. I've lived here. I had my family here. I'm ready to die here. Don't send me away. And he said, I have nothing. I have to send you. And I said, I'll stay. I'll be her monitor. I'll just hold her wrist, and if her pulse changes, I know what to do. There's a crash cart. And I sat with her all night, and at like 7 a.m. the next morning, Saturday morning, her rhythm just spontaneously changed, all on its own, to a normal rhythm, and she was fine. And many months later, her grown son, who was older than me, came up to me and he said, do you remember how you saved my mother? And I said, please don't say that. I didn't do anything at all. She got better all by herself. And he said, no, she was scared to die on you that night as a young doctor. She didn't want to scare you to death. And she reminded me once again of a very old adage from home, that our job is to become the best human being possible. Not to be a fancy professional with a fancy posture, but to be great human beings. And we must demand that and ask that from our post-secondary institutions and from our students. Thank you.